Chapter 79. The Roar of the Beastketeers. The battlefield was a storm of steel and blood. Across the ruined lands of Eurasania, the Beastketeers, Albis, Sufia, and Phobio, charged into battle, cutting through Clayman's forces like predators reclaiming their hunting grounds. For weeks, their homeland had been occupied. Their people had been crushed under the rule of a cowardly manipulator who had used deception instead of strength. But now they had returned, and they would take back what was theirs. A battle of speed and savagery. The Beastketeers were not ordinary warriors. They were the greatest combatants of the Beast Kingdom, personally chosen by Carrion himself to stand at the peak of their people's strength. Albis, the golden serpent, moved with calculated precision, her golden whip slashing through enemy ranks like a blade of pure light. Every flick of her wrist sent shockwaves through the battlefield, tearing armor, flesh, and morale apart with terrifying grace. Sufia, the Crimson Panther, waded through enemy lines like a force of nature. She fought with her bare fists crushing weapons, helmets, and bones alike. Her combat style was raw, unfiltered destruction, a display of brute strength that sent waves of fear through Clayman's soldiers. Phobio, the Black Storm, was different. His past failures had haunted him, but today was his redemption. The rage he had once struggled to control was now his weapon. He moved like a shadow in the storm, striking with rapid, relentless blows that left no room for counterattacks. They did not fight alone. The remaining warriors of Eurasania, those who had survived Clayman's treachery, had joined them. Fueled by the will to reclaim their home, they fought with renewed ferocity. But their true allies came from beyond their own lands. Rimuru Tempest had sent reinforcements. His forces had stepped onto the battlefield, not just as supporters, but as warriors fighting side by side with the Beastketeers. The result? Clayman's forces never stood a chance. The arrival of Yamza, Clayman's lieutenant. Among the chaos, a single warrior stepped forward. His name was Yamza, a high-ranking officer of Clayman's army. He was known for his speed, agility, and tactical prowess. Unlike the brute force of the Beastketeers, he fought with finesse, using quick strikes and evasive movements to outmaneuver his enemies. He wasn't afraid. In his eyes, Clayman was superior. And if he was Clayman's chosen warrior, then surely he could crush these beasts. That was his first mistake. Yamza versus the Beastketeers, a reality check. At first, Yamza fought with confidence. His speed allowed him to weave between Albi's deadly whip, avoid Sufia's devastating punches, and counter Phobio's aggressive strikes. For a moment, it looked like he had the advantage. But then, the Beastketeers began to adapt. Albi's attacks became unpredictable. She coiled her whip around Yamza's defenses, limiting his movement with surgical precision. Sufia stopped chasing him. Instead, she forced him into corners, making every dodge harder and every counterattack riskier. Phobio stopped being reckless. He let Yamza attack, absorbing blows like a storm waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then they struck together. Yamza barely had time to react as Sufia landed the first blow, sending him skidding across the battlefield. Albis followed, her whip wrapping around his legs, pulling him into the dirt. And then came Phobio. With a roar that shook the battlefield, he struck. The impact sent Yamza flying, his body slamming into the ruins of a collapsed fortress. Dust and debris clouded the air. Silence followed. Yamza struggled to his feet, coughing, bleeding. His confidence was gone. For the first time in his life, he felt fear. The choice, fight or surrender. Yamza's hands trembled. His breath was ragged. He had always believed that Clayman's power made him invincible. But now, with the Beastketeers standing before him, with their unyielding strength and their burning resolve, he realized the truth. Clayman's power was an illusion, and he was fighting for a lie. He had only two choices: surrender or die, and he wasn't sure which was worse. Key takeaways from the Beastketeers' counterattack. The Beastketeers, after being forced out of their homeland, return with unmatched strength and fury. Their alliance with Rimuru's forces proves their unity and growing influence. Yamza, a high-ranking officer of Clayman, is completely outmatched. His belief in his own superiority shatters. The battle proves that Clayman's army is weaker than it appeared. The cracks in his empire are beginning to show. The battlefield was theirs. But the war was far from over. Phobio versus Tyr, a battle of growth and vengeance. The battlefield was drenched in blood, but Phobio had no time to stop. He had fought alongside the Beastketeers, reclaiming ground from Clayman's forces, proving himself after his past failures. But now, as he stood catching his breath, a new enemy emerged. A soft, almost mocking giggle echoed through the chaos. Tyr, a member of the moderate Harlequin Alliance, a mysterious and deadly organization that operated in the shadows. Unlike Clayman's brainwashed troops, Tyr was different. She wasn't fighting because she was forced to. She fought because she enjoyed it. She had been watching the battle unfold, her eerie smile never fading. And now, with her companion footman handling the others, she finally set her sights on Phobio. The battle was personal. And for Phobio, this wasn't just about victory, this was about proving how far he had come. Tyr's deadly playfulness. Tyr wasn't just another warrior. She wasn't a mindless brute or a soldier who followed orders. She was a killer. Her movements were unpredictable. She danced across the battlefield with an eerie grace, dodging attacks as if she could see the future. Her magic was brutal, focused on rapid, pinpoint strikes aimed at exploiting weaknesses before her enemies even realized they had them. And worst of all, she enjoyed every second of it. Tyr laughed as she fought, treating the battle like a game. "You're trying so hard," she giggled, dodging one of Phobio's punches. "But it won't matter," she whispered, appearing behind him in a blur of speed. "Because you're still just the weak little cub." The words cut deeper than her attacks. She knew. She knew about Phobio's past failures, how he had let his rage control him, how he had once been defeated by Malim, how he had struggled to prove himself as a warrior. Tyr was not just fighting him. She was taunting him, and Phobio was losing. Phobio's struggle, facing his own weakness. Phobio was fast. He was strong. He had trained relentlessly to become better, to overcome the failures of his past. But Tyr was different. She wasn't physically stronger, but she was smarter. She wasn't faster, but she was more precise. And most importantly, she wasn't afraid of him. Every time Phobio attacked, she was already gone. Every time he tried to counter, she was a step ahead. His frustration grew. His anger boiled. And that was exactly what Tyr wanted. She grinned as she dodged another one of his wild punches. "So sloppy. So desperate. Is that all you've got?" Phobio roared, losing himself in rage, lunging at her with reckless force. And in that moment, she struck. The moment of near death. Pain exploded through Phobio's chest. Before he even realized what had happened, Tyr's dagger was buried in his side. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to make him understand. Phobio's vision blurred as he staggered back, his hand clutching the wound. Tyr tilted her head, her smile never fading. "See? I told you. Still just a cub playing at being a lion." For the first time, Phobio felt true despair. All his training, all his struggles, and it still wasn't enough. Tyr had played with him like a toy, and now she was going to kill him. The turning point, Phobio's awakening. But just as Tyr stepped forward for the final strike, something changed. Phobio's grip on his wound tightened. His breath steadied. And then he laughed. Tyr's smirk faltered for the first time. "What's so funny?" Phobio wiped the blood from his mouth and grinned. "I get it now. You wanted me to lose control. You thought I'd panic, fall apart, let you win." Tyr's eyes narrowed. Phobio rolled his shoulders, straightening himself. "But I'm not that guy anymore. I'm not the weak cub you think I am. And you're not as untouchable as you pretend to be." Tyr clicked her tongue in annoyance. And just like that, the real fight began. Phobio's counterattack. Now, Phobio fought differently. He no longer relied on brute force alone. He stopped chasing Tyr's speed. Instead, he anticipated her movements. He stopped letting her dictate the fight. Instead, he forced her into his rhythm. And suddenly, Tyr was the one struggling. Phobio's blows were landing. His strikes were forcing her back. And for the first time, Tyr wasn't laughing. She snarled, realizing she had made a mistake. Phobio had been holding back. And now he wasn't anymore. Tyr's retreat a hollow victory. Tyr wasn't stupid. She knew when a battle was no longer fun. She clicked her tongue in irritation, dodging one last punch before leaping back, vanishing into the chaos of the battlefield. TCH? Whatever. This game got boring anyway. Phobio did not chase her, because he had already won. Not by killing her, not by overpowering her, but by proving that he had grown. He had faced his weakness, and he had come out stronger. For the first time, Phobio stood tall, not as a failure but as a warrior. And the battle for Eurasania continued. Key takeaways from Phobio versus Tyr. Tyr is a dangerous and manipulative opponent, using psychological warfare to weaken her enemies. Phobio initially struggles, still haunted by his past failures. By facing his weaknesses head-on, Phobio finds clarity and fights smarter instead of relying on brute force. Tyr realizes she underestimated him and retreats, marking Phobio's first true victory as a warrior. This wasn't just a fight. This was Phobio's rebirth. And the war was far from over. Geld's intervention, the Orc King enters the fray. The battlefield was a storm of blood and steel, and amidst the chaos, the tides of war continued to shift. The Beastketeers had launched their counterattack. Phobio had faced down Tyr, proving that he was no longer the reckless fighter he once was. But Clayman's forces still stood, and among them was another monstrous threat, one who delighted in destruction. Footman the Angry Pierrot, a member of the moderate Harlequin Alliance, Footman was not just a warrior. He was a nightmare in human form. He was massive, his round, bloated body hiding terrifying strength beneath his clownish appearance. He fought with overwhelming force, his sheer weight and power smashing through enemy lines. And worst of all, he was laughing the entire time, as if every life he crushed was just another joke. As he rampaged across the battlefield, it became clear. If someone didn't stop him soon, Clayman's forces might still turn the tide. And then the earth trembled. A new figure stepped onto the battlefield. The air grew heavy, thick with raw, unshakable dominance. Clayman's forces hesitated, their weapons lowering ever so slightly, because standing before them was a being they could not break. Standing before them was Geld, the Orc King, the arrival of an unbreakable force. Geld was not like other warriors. He did not fight with speed like Phobio. He did not fight with agility like the Beastketeers. He fought with absolute endurance, with unstoppable resilience. And as he took his first step forward, the battlefield itself seemed to shake beneath his weight. His massive frame towered over the battlefield, his golden armor shimmering with raw magical energy. His aura was different from the others, not aggressive, not chaotic, but heavy, like a mountain that could never be moved. His eyes burned with unwavering loyalty, not to a nation, not to a cause, but to Rimuru Tempest. The forces of Clayman hesitated. But Footman? He smiled. Footman versus Geld, the clash of titans. The moment was inevitable. Two giants, two unstoppable forces of destruction, and only one would stand. Footman let out a cackling laugh, clapping his hands together. "Oh, you're a big one, huh? I like that. I like it a lot. Let's see which one of us breaks first." Without another word, he lunged, and Geld did not move. The first strike landed squarely against Geld's armored chest, sending a deafening shockwave across the battlefield. Dust and debris exploded outward. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, as the dust cleared, Geld was still standing. He hadn't even flinched. His golden armor was untouched, and Footman's grin twitched. "Ha!" Geld exhaled slowly. "Was that supposed to hurt?" Footman's eyes narrowed. The amusement in his face flickered, just for a second. And then Geld moved, the power of the Orc King. Geld's punch came like a meteor. Where Footman had been playing, Geld was not. His massive fist crashed against Footman's bloated frame, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. Footman, who had never been forced back before, suddenly found himself skidding across the ground, his massive body slamming into the remains of a collapsed building. For the first time, he looked stunned. Geld rolled his shoulders. His expression didn't change. He wasn't here to fight for fun. He was here to win. The battle continues, the difference in strength. Footman growled, pushing himself up. Okay, that was a good one. You're strong. I like that. He cracked his oversized knuckles, stretching his shoulders. His grin returned, but this time it was different. Not mocking, not playful. It was real. And then he charged again. But Geld didn't move, because he didn't need to. Every attack Footman threw, Geld tanked without hesitation. Every blow meant to crush his body. Geld absorbed like an unshakable fortress. And when the time came for Geld to strike back, he did so with the force of a natural disaster. The battlefield shook as Geld's fist collided with Footman's face. This time, Footman didn't just stumble. He flew. His massive body crashed through debris, rolling across the ground before finally coming to a stop. And this time, he didn't get up right away. The true strength of a king. Geld's voice was calm, even. You think you're strong because you enjoy destruction, because you think no one can stand up to you. He took a step forward. But I don't fight for pleasure. Another step. I don't fight for myself. Another step. I fight for my people. And now he stood over Footman. And that's why you'll never win. Footman, for the first time, looked up at someone else. And for the first time, he felt small. Footman retreats. The Orc King stands victorious. Footman gritted his teeth. He could still fight. He could keep going. But there was something different about Geld. Something that told him this wasn't a fight he could win. Not here. Not today. He clicked his tongue, shaking off the dust as he stepped back. Tsh. Whatever. Not worth the effort. Next time, big guy. And just like that, he retreated into the chaos. The battle wasn't over. But Geld had made his message clear. This battlefield belonged to Tempest, and nothing would take it from them. Key takeaways from Geld's intervention. Geld enters the battle as an immovable force, countering Footman's overwhelming strength with sheer resilience. Despite Footman's brutality, he cannot break through Geld's defenses. Geld proves that true strength comes from loyalty, not destruction. Footman realizes he cannot win and chooses to retreat, marking a massive victory for Tempest. The battlefield was shifting, and soon Clayman's army would fall completely. Yamza's transformation and downfall, Desperation's final gamble. The battlefield was littered with the remnants of Clayman's shattered army. The Beastketeers had returned with vengeance, tearing through the invaders who had dared to take their homeland. Phobio had overcome Tyr, proving that he was no longer the reckless warrior of his past. Geld had crushed Footman, showing that brute force alone was meaningless without purpose. And now, only one of Clayman's top lieutenants remained. Yamza. He had fought desperately to prove his superiority, but the reality was undeniable. He had lost. The Beastketeers had exposed his weakness, breaking through his defenses. His troops were either dead or fleeing, leaving him alone on the battlefield. But Yamza was not ready to die. Not like this. Not before he had one last chance. And so, in a final act of desperation, he made the worst mistake of his life. He took Clayman's gift, the magic item, a desperate gamble. Yamza's hands trembled as he reached into his robes, fingers closing around the small vial that Clayman had given him. A forbidden potion, a last resort. Clayman had assured him, if you ever find yourself facing defeat, drink this. It will grant you the power you need. It will make you more than human. Yamza hesitated for only a second. Then, with a single motion, he swallowed the potion whole. And the nightmare began. The transformation, becoming the monster. The moment the liquid touched his throat, Yamza's entire body convulsed. A searing pain ripped through his flesh, his vision darkening as his body rejected its own existence. Then the mutation began. His bones cracked and elongated, his limbs stretching into grotesque, unnatural forms. His skin darkened, shifting into scaly, armored plates. His eyes lost all humanity, turning into glowing red orbs filled with nothing but hunger and madness. And then, the final change. A roar erupted from his throat. No longer a human sound. No longer the voice of Yamza, the commander. This was something else. Something that should not exist. The Charybdis-like monster losing control. What Yamza had become was a beast, a weapon, something far beyond what even he had imagined. But there was one problem. He was no longer in control. The moment he completed his transformation, his thoughts dissolved into raw instinct. He was not stronger. He was not smarter. He was just another mindless monster. And the first thing this new creature saw? The forces of Tempest. And so it attacked. The final battle, the beast meets its end. For all its horrific size and monstrous strength, the new Yamza was not invincible. It raged, tearing apart the battlefield, smashing everything in sight. But it had no strategy, no direction, only mindless destruction. And worst of all, it was alone. And Tempest never fought alone. Geld stood firm, his massive armored frame blocking the creature's first wild charge. The Beastketeers struck, their combined strength forcing the monster back. Even Phobio, still recovering from his fight with Tyr, joined the assault. The battle was brutal, but it was one-sided. Yamza had sacrificed everything, believing that he would become a god of war. Instead, he had become a footnote in history, and with one final, crushing blow, his monstrous form collapsed, his body dissolving into dust. The fight was over, and Yamza was gone. Clayman's cruelty, the puppet master's true nature. As the dust settled, the warriors of Tempest and the Beastketeers exchanged glances. This wasn't just a victory, this was an execution. Yamza had believed that Clayman cared about his subordinates, that he had been given a gift, a final chance at power. But the truth was far more horrifying. Clayman had never intended for Yamza to survive. The potion had not been meant to empower him. It had been a disposable tool. Yamza had not been saved. He had been discarded. And in the end, he had meant nothing. The aftermath, a strategic victory. With Yamza dead and his forces obliterated, the battle was over. The Beastketeers stood victorious. Geld remained unshaken, a living wall that no enemy had passed. And Tempest had proven, once again, that they were unstoppable. This was not just a victory on the battlefield. This was a message to Clayman, to the Empire, to whoever else dared to oppose Rimuru Tempest. The age of monsters bowing to human ambition was over, and anyone who dared to challenge them would meet the same fate. Key takeaways from Yamza's transformation and downfall. Yamza, in desperation, uses a magic potion from Clayman, hoping to gain ultimate power. The transformation turns him into a monstrous beast, but he loses all control. Tempest's forces work together, easily defeating the mindless creature. Yamza's death proves that Clayman never valued his subordinates. He saw them as disposable. This battle sends a message. Tempest is unstoppable, and their enemies will not survive. The war was ending, and Clayman's fall was inevitable. Strategic victory for Tempest. The war comes to an end. The battle was over. The forces of Clayman had been annihilated. The Beastketeers had taken back their honor and their homeland. The monster Yamza had become, his final act of desperation had been crushed. And now the battlefield belonged to Tempest. But this was more than just a military victory. This was a statement, a declaration, that Tempest was here to stay, that the time of monsters bowing to humans had ended, and that anyone who dared to stand against Rimuru Tempest would be destroyed. The aftermath, taking control of the battlefield. The warriors of Tempest and Eurysania stood victorious, surveying the ruins of the battlefield. Albiz, Sufia, and Phobio had reclaimed their kingdom, proving that the Beastketeers were not to be underestimated. Geld had stood like an unbreakable fortress, showcasing the raw power of Tempest's elite warriors. Phobio had grown, overcoming his past failures and emerging as a true warrior. And most importantly, Clayman's forces were gone. The few survivors had fled, their will shattered. The once proud army of Clayman, the so-called Marionette Legion, was nothing more than scattered remnants of a failed war. Their leader had abandoned them, and now Tempest stood unchallenged. The fall of Clayman, his empire collapses. This battle had not been fought in isolation. The Demon Lord's Council Valpurgis was happening at the same time. And Clayman himself? He was there, trying to manipulate the strongest beings in existence, trying to control the outcome of the war through deception. And just as his army collapsed on the battlefield, he was losing at Valpurgis. His lies had been exposed. His power had been proven inferior. His puppet strings had been cut. And now he was alone. His perfect plan had failed. His army had disappeared. His war was over. And soon, Clayman himself would fall. Rimuru's influence grows, a new era begins. Tempest had won. But this was just the beginning. This war was supposed to be a message from Clayman, a display of his power to intimidate the world. Instead, it had become a demonstration of Tempest's dominance. And now, the world was watching. The Empire had taken notice. They had believed that Clayman's army would win, but now they knew the truth. The Demon Lords were forced to acknowledge Rimuru as more than just an upstart. He was a ruler, a force they could not ignore. And across nations, monsters and humans alike whispered a single name. Rimuru Tempest. Not just a slime, not just a demon lord, but a king. The war had ended, but Tempest's reign was only beginning. Key takeaways from the strategic victory for Tempest. Clayman's army is completely wiped out, securing a decisive victory. The Beastketeers reclaim their homeland, proving their strength. Geld and Phobio showcase their growth, setting the stage for their future roles. Clayman, still at Valpurgis, realizes his entire war effort has collapsed. Tempest's victory sends a message to the world. Rimuru is not just a demon lord, but a rising power. The battlefield was silent, but the echoes of this war would be felt across the world. And now all eyes were on Rimuru Tempest, the final confrontation, Clayman's last stand. Clayman had lost. His army was annihilated. His forces were scattered. His strongest warriors, Yamza, Tyr, Footman, had been crushed by the forces of Tempest and Eurazania. But the battle wasn't over yet, because while his army fell on the battlefield, Clayman himself was still standing, or at least trying to. Valpurgis, the gathering of the demon lords, had become his final battlefield. And as the shadows of true power closed in around him, Clayman finally realized he was already dead. The broken puppet, Clayman's desperation. Clayman had walked into Valpurgis believing that he was in control, that his words, his schemes, his manipulations would bend the other demon lords to his will. But the truth? Rimuru had flipped the script. Malim had never been under his control. Carrion, the one he claimed to have killed, was alive. His army, the foundation of his power, had been erased. And the worst part? The demon lords weren't even surprised. Guy Crimson had never believed him to begin with. Dino and De Gruel had dismissed him as weak. Leon Cromwell saw no reason to acknowledge him. Ramiris openly mocked him. They had never respected him. He had never belonged among them. And now, they would watch as he was erased. Rimuru versus Clayman, no more words. For most of Valpurgis, Clayman had hidden behind words, lies, manipulation, and deception. But now words had lost their power, and Rimuru had had enough. Rimuru stood from his seat, stepping forward with an unshakable presence. His golden eyes bore into Clayman, not with rage, but with disappointment. This wasn't even a battle. This was a reckoning. Clayman felt the weight of that gaze. And for the first time since the night began, he felt fear. Clayman's final transformation, a last act of defiance. But Clayman was not the type to accept his fate. No, he would fight back, even if the war was already lost, even if his army was dead, even if his lies had been exposed. He would not go quietly. With a scream of desperation, he activated his final power, consuming every last ounce of magic he had left. His body twisted, transforming into something grotesque and monstrous. A true demon formed from his own desperation and rage. He roared, throwing his power wildly at Rimuru. Black flames tore through the air. The ground cracked beneath his energy. His aura pulsed, chaotic and uncontrolled. But Rimuru, he didn't even flinch. Clayman's final transformation had changed nothing, because power without control was meaningless. Rimuru's judgment, the demon lord's true power. Clayman screamed, launching his strongest attack. A wave of raw destruction, surging toward Rimuru. The same attack that had eradicated entire armies before. The same attack that had made him believe he was a true demon lord. And then, Rimuru lifted his hand, and with a flick of his wrist, Clayman's strongest attack disappeared. No struggle, no grand counterattack, just pure, absolute superiority. Clayman froze, his breath caught in his throat, because in that moment he understood. Rimuru wasn't just stronger than him. He was on a completely different level, and there was nothing he could do. The execution, Clayman's end. Clayman's mind raced. He had one last chance. He could flee. He could beg. He could try to plead for mercy. But he knew the truth. Rimuru was not like him. Rimuru was not a manipulator. Rimuru was a ruler, a true demon lord, and rulers did not show mercy to traitors. A final, agonized scream erupted from Clayman's throat as Rimuru ended it in an instant. A final flash of magic, a surge of absolute power, and then, silence. Clayman was gone. His schemes, his army, his entire existence, wiped from the world. And in that moment, Walpurgis was over. The aftermath, the demon lords react. As the dust settled, the remaining demon lords observed Rimuru with newfound respect. Guy Crimson smirked, clearly entertained by what had just happened. Malim stretched, looking completely unfazed, as if she had known this would happen all along. Leon Cromwell, normally indifferent, gave Rimuru a single glance before acknowledging him with a slight nod. No words were spoken. None were needed, because the message was clear. Rimuru was now one of them, not because he had taken a title, not because he had declared himself a demon lord, but because he had proven himself, and the world would never be the same again. The war was over, and in its place a new era had begun, the era of Rimuru Tempest.